They called us the new ones, not with warmth, and not with cruelty, just with the kind of flat certainty that comes from knowing where everything belongs. Humans had been part of the galactic concordance for 11 years. 11 years out of the thousands that the Kethi, the Fine, the Thari, and a dozen other species had spent building it. To them, we were late arrivals who had shown up to a party that had been running perfectly fine without us. They were polite about it, mostly. That almost made it worse. My name is Elias Vorn. I was 24 years old when I arrived at the Kethtal Military Academy, and I was the only human in my cohort. Not the only human in the Academy's history. There had been 3 others before me, all of them in support tracks, none of them in tactical analysis. I was the first human to be accepted into the combat command stream. The admission board made sure I knew that. They said it like a gift. I received it like a warning. The Academy sat on a station world, carved into the side of an asteroid the size of a small continent. It had been operating for over 300 years. The corridors were built for 7-limbed bodies, for wingspans, for species that communicated partly through pheromones and partly through color shifts in their skin. Everything about the place reminded you, gently and constantly, that it had not been designed with you in mind. I spent my first 2 weeks walking sideways through doorways that were too wide in the wrong direction, and sitting in chairs that tilted my body at an angle that made my lower back ache by evening. Nobody did that to me on purpose. That was the point. My bunkmate was a fine cadet named Surai. The fine were small, quick, and covered in fine feathers that changed color depending on their emotional state. Surai's feathers were almost always a calm gray-blue, which I learned meant they were concentrating. When they were nervous, which happened more than it should have, the feathers went flat and pale. Surai was brilliant with navigation systems, and completely terrible at self-defense training. We did not have a lot in common, but we both ate breakfast at the same strange early hour, both of us too wired to sleep past the station's 4th bell, and that was enough to start a friendship. I want to tell you about Grax Vel, because you need to understand him before you can understand what happened. Grax Vel was Kethi. His species were ambush hunters by evolution. 7 limbs, a heavy chitinous shell across their upper body, and a jaw structure that could exert enough pressure to bend structural steel. He stood about a foot taller than me and outweighed me by 180 pounds of solid armor. He was also the top-ranked cadet in our cohort, and the favorite to graduate first in his class. He was not stupid. He was not even, by Kethi standards, particularly aggressive. But he had a habit, a small, practiced, casual habit of making certain cadets feel like they did not belong. He never did anything that broke a rule clearly enough to report. He would stand in a doorway until you had to ask him to move, and then he would move with elaborate, mocking slowness. He would speak in a Kethi subdialect during group discussions, one that the translator implants struggled with, so that his jokes landed for everyone except you, and the whole table would laugh while you sat there watching their faces and understanding nothing. He would accidentally knock your equipment off a shelf and then look at the mess with an expression that said, very clearly, that he was waiting for you to clean it up. I reported none of it. I ran the math every time. Reporting would cost me credibility, allies, and 2 weeks of bureaucratic process. Enduring it would cost me nothing except a piece of my patience, which I had always had in good supply. I was going to graduate from this academy. I was going to do it quietly and cleanly, and when it was done, I would be the first human combat command officer in the Concordance's history, and that would mean more than any argument I could win in a disciplinary hearing. That was the plan. That was always the human plan. We are, when we choose to be, extraordinarily patient creatures. People forget that about us. They see the emotional surface, and they miss the engine running underneath. The day everything changed was an ordinary one, right up until it was not. It was a rest period in the open bay, 3 hours in the afternoon when the cadets could sleep, study, or do whatever they needed to do to stay functional. I was sitting on my bunk reading a tactical history text on my datapad. Surai was at their desk, running navigation simulations. The bay held about 20 cadets from 5 different species, all of us doing our own quiet things. I heard Surai's chair scrape back. Then I heard nothing, which was wrong, because Surai was always making small sounds, tapping their stylus, murmuring numbers to themselves, the soft rustle of feathers shifting. I looked up. Grax Vel had crossed the bay. He had one of his lower arms pressed against the bulkhead beside Surai's desk, not touching them, but close enough to make the space feel like a trap. He was saying something in that subdialect again, low and unhurried, and two cadets near the back of the bay were watching with the expressions of people who found this mildly interesting. The rest of the room had found something else to look at. Surai's feathers had gone completely flat against their skull, pale, almost white. I had never seen that before. In 11 weeks of living beside them, I had seen Surai nervous, tired, frustrated, and once deeply homesick. I had never seen that particular color. It took me a moment to understand what I was looking at, and then I understood. This was not nervousness. This was an animal response to a predator. This was fear, at a level that had bypassed thinking entirely, and gone straight to the part of the brain that controls whether you freeze or run. I put my datapad down. I ran the math. It took about 2 seconds. There are moments when the calculation changes, not because the variables are different, but because you are. Because something shifts in you, quietly, and suddenly the answer you kept getting before stops being the right one. I had been measuring the cost of acting against the cost of graduating, and for months the answer had always come out the same. But standing in that bay, watching Surai sit white and frozen, while 20 cadets from 5 species looked away, I recalculated, and the answer came out differently. I crossed the bay in 6 steps. I want to be very precise about what I did next, because the way people tell it afterward always gets something wrong. I did not shout. I did not threaten. I did not give a speech. I threw a single punch, a compact, tight, rotational right hook, the kind my coach in Osaka had spent 4 years drilling into my muscle memory until it lived below thought, aimed directly at the mandible joint on the right side of Graxvel's face. It was the only fully unarmored structure on a Kethai skull. I had known that for 3 months. The Kethai biology file was in the standard cadet reference library. I had read it on my 3rd day. The sound was very loud. Graxvel went down. Not stumbling, not staggering. Down. His full weight hit the floor of the bay, and the impact trembled through the deck plating, and then there was silence. I stood there breathing evenly, looking at him on the floor, and I said 2 words, "He's done." Then I stepped back and waited. I want to tell you what that silence sounded like, because I have thought about it many times since. It was not the silence of shock exactly. It was deeper than that. It was the silence of an assumption dying. For 11 weeks, every cadet in that room had carried a quiet, unspoken belief that humans were soft, that we were here on some kind of diplomatic courtesy, that our presence in the academy was a political gesture rather than a real threat. That belief had been so solid and so comfortable that nobody had ever needed to say it out loud. And in about 3/4 of a second, it had ceased to be true, and the room had not yet figured out what to replace it with. Graxvel was not seriously hurt. A dislocated joint, a bruised pride, and a story he would have to tell for the rest of his career. He was helped to the medical bay by 2 cadets who kept looking back at me over their shoulders as they left, wearing expressions I had not seen directed at a human before. We were both brought before Commandant Drun the following morning. The commandant was Thari, one of the oldest intelligent species in the concordance. She was small, dense, and appeared to be made entirely of quiet authority. She had been running the Kethtal Academy for 60 years, and had seen, by her own count, nearly everything. She listened to Graxvel's account without expression. She listened to 3 witness testimonies. She listened to Surai, who spoke in a voice so small it was barely audible, and who told the truth with the precise, careful honesty of someone who understood exactly what it was going to cost them, and did it anyway. Then she looked at me and asked me to explain myself. I said that I had assessed the situation, made a decision, and was prepared to accept whatever consequence followed from it. I said it once, clearly, and then I stopped talking. Drun was quiet for a long moment. Then she said that Graxvel would be removed from the cohort's leadership track, and that a full review of the semester's conduct reports would be opened immediately. She assigned me 3 weeks of additional operational duties. She looked at me across the table with eyes that had watched 60 years of young soldiers learn who they were, and she said something I have never forgotten. Humans have been in space for 11 years. In that time, they have done nothing slowly. I suggest this academy begin paying attention to why. That was all. We were dismissed. I will not tell you that everything changed overnight, because it did not. The academy did not suddenly embrace humanity. Prejudice does not work that way. It retreats slowly, the way something cold retreats from heat, gradually, and from the edges first. But things shifted. Small things. Real things. The Pyroth cadet from my tactical theory class asked me one evening about human warfare history, not in a testing way, in an honestly curious way, the way you ask about something that has started to seem more interesting than you initially gave it credit for. I talked with him for 2 hours. He came back the next week with more questions. A Sulaki engineer from the cohort below mine found me in the training yard and asked what boxing was. I explained it as best I could. She wanted to know why humans had developed a system of fighting with bare hands when we were so physically unremarkable compared to most other species. I thought about it for a moment and then told her the truth. Because for most of our history, our hands were all we had, and we got very, very good at using them. She thought about that for a while. Then she nodded slowly, in the Sulaki way that means genuine understanding rather than simple agreement, and walked off. 2 weeks after the incident, Graxvel found me in the corridor outside the equipment room. He did not apologize. I want to be accurate about that. He did not say sorry, and I did not expect him to. But he stopped in front of me, and he looked at me directly, which among the Kethai is a gesture reserved for equals, and he said that the fight had been fair. In his culture, that is more than most people ever offer. I nodded once. He moved on. I moved on. We were not friends, but we were no longer something else, and in a place like that academy, in a galaxy still figuring out what humans were supposed to be, that mattered. I think about that afternoon sometimes, the moment I put down my datapad, crossed the room, and let 11 weeks of patience reach its end. I think about what I said to myself before I stood up. I ran the numbers and got a different answer, and I acted on it. Not from anger, not from heroism, from math. But the math had a variable in it I had been discounting for months, and that variable was this. Invisibility has a cost too. Being overlooked, being dismissed, being the thing that nobody takes seriously. It compounds, quietly, until it is no longer a price worth paying. I had been so focused on the long game that I had stopped noticing what the short game was doing to me, and to Surai, and to every other cadet in that room who had been watching and looking away and telling themselves it was not their problem. I graduated from Kethtal 16 months later, first in my tactical analysis stream. Surai graduated 2 months after me, top of their navigation cohort, and we served together for 9 years on a concordance vessel with a crew of 11 species, including, eventually, improbably, a Kethai second officer who shook my hand on the first day with the kind of grip that was testing something. I matched it exactly. He seemed satisfied. What one punch started was not a war, and it was not a legend. It was something smaller and more durable than either of those things. It was the end of an assumption. And in a galaxy of 1,000 species still learning to see each other clearly, ending one wrong assumption on one ordinary afternoon, in one bay, on one station, built into an asteroid, that turned out to be enough to begin. We did not earn our place in the concordance by being the strongest species, or the oldest, or the wisest. We earned it the same way we earn most things, by showing up, by refusing to disappear, and by occasionally surprising people so completely that they have no choice but to pay attention. I have never minded being underestimated. It makes the math easier.